The topic this year is Web 2.0 based research impact metrics. So in the next 1 hour, we will discuss whether we should change something in measuring the research impact. Should we change something? Never mind whether it's measuring for the purpose of hiring some professor, promotion, or any assessment, or whether it's for the purpose of centometrics, meaning some study of science, or for making some decisions. So it's obvious that something is changed in the last few decades, and should that be reflected as well in the measuring the impact of research. And I will just briefly read the housekeeping rules. So we have 3 panelists. One which is talking should be unmuted, of course, and the other should be muted, but I suggest that the camera are turned on during the complete panel session for all of us. And of course, I would like to encourage also the attendees to take a part in the discussion through some questions in Q&A or in the chat, or even by raising the hand, and I can unmute them after that, and then they can discuss with us the topic. So it's obvious that, you know, the open science paradigm, digitalization, interdisciplinarity, and internationalization has significantly changed the research process, the way how we collaborate with each other, how we disseminate the results. And of course, it also changed the impact of scholarly work in the last couple of decades, meaning the impact is not only now on the scholarly community, I think it's also on the completely citizens, to all citizens, to community completely, let's say. So there are some opinions that assessment of impact might include also some new metrics based on Web 2.0 channels, some Altmetrics or some other metrics. However, it's not yet fully adapted because there are some issues in data quality, heterogeneity of data sources and APIs, and potential manipulation as with any metric, you know. So, but basically, we will discuss today whether we should change something, what barriers we should overcome to do that, and how we can see the future in the measuring of the research impact. And I'm really glad that I have 3 really nice panelists today with me. The first one is Cristina Huidiu from the Digital Science. She's a digital solution specialist for Altmetric and Dimensions. She's working with universities and research institutes to leverage their strategy around research communication and research assessment. And before joining Digital Science and the Altmetric team, Cristina used to be a medical librarian focused on the responsible use of metrics, delivering trainings for all library resources and organizing science-focused events. The second panelist is Josh Nicholson, who is a co-founder and CEO of Smart Cite, or Scite, which is a deep learning platform that allows anyone to see how a scientific paper has been cited, not just how many times, and specifically if it has been supported or contrasted by other studies. So it's not just the number of how many times something is cited, but also in which context it's cited. Previously, he was founder and CEO of the Winnower and CEO of Authorea, 2 companies aimed at improving how scientists publish and collaborate. And he holds a PhD in cell biology from Virginia Tech. And the third panelist is Mike Taylor. After 20 years working for a major publisher, mostly in their research and development department, but also spells working with books, journals, and metrics, Mike joined the Digital Science. For the last 5 years, he's been splitting his time between Dimensions and Altmetric. With a Bachelor of Science in Psychology, a theater company, and an active archaeological research project, Mike is really well positioned to talk about the arts, humanities, and social sciences. And as I said, we will have 3 topics. The first one will be related to the changes in the science and some needs for new metrics. The second one will be related to the barriers for wide adoption of those new metrics. And the third topic will be prediction of the future, what we can expect in the next couple of years. So the first topic is changes in the science needs for new metrics. And the question is, but of course I don't want to limit our discussion only on this question. Any other aspect of needs for new metrics should be mentioned and discussed. What the effect has the development of information communication technology, and especially the internet, made on the change in scholarly outcomes types and communication patterns in the last couple of decades? Firstly, I suggest that Cristina started with this question. So,
my favorite type of questions. So feel free to interrupt and challenge everything I say, either the rest of the panelists or the attendees as well. And I'll try and be as challengeable as possible. That being said, I think with the development of technology, there's just more of everything, but that hasn't necessarily made us better at communicating research. And I've seen a lot of articles around, let's try and match the Twitter mentions with the growth in citations, but not a lot about how communications of science changes people's behavior, which is really where the conversation should be, or at least that's where I think the conversation should be. And then when it comes to metrics, of course, the more of everything has led to an increase in just the challenges in getting funding, the challenges in getting partnerships, in corporate partnerships or otherwise. And then you need more complex type metrics, for the lack of a better word, to make sense of it all. And then we will go into the second question, that there's of course the limitations of the data that you have, the format in which it is available, and what you can really make with it. How possible is it to find out all of the different biases that live in the data, that are not necessarily data by themselves, but also cultural biases, and how do you handle those? And it's not an easy question to answer, and I don't plan on answering it. But I do hope that the conversations that we will have for the next hour will just give me some more ideas around the topic.
Thank you very much. So it's now Josh's turn. So Josh, I know that you was a CEO for some, let's say, platforms involved also in changing of the scholarly communication. So I'm expecting from you also some interesting point of view on this question. So Josh, it's your turn now.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's quite early in New York. I don't think I've talked about scholarly communication at such an hour, so it should be fun. Unfortunately, I think, the internet and the web has not changed scholarly communication much at all. So if you look at, a PDF from the 1600s published in the Royal Society of Biology, it looks quite similar to what you'd see published, this year. And so I think this industry or academia is very tradition bound. We value these things not changing a lot. And so it's been hard to introduce new types of articles, new ways of communicating, because really they're tied to evaluation so much, which I think ties well with the next question. And so I think there is definitely more. And so I would agree with that first point, and there's going to continue to be more. But it's remarkable because even in 1960, there's interviews with Eugene Garfield talking about a flood of information. And if you think that was a flood, I mean, that was really a puddle compared to what we have today. And so I think the possibilities have changed greatly, right? There's a lot more that we can do with how we communicate scientific information, but I would say they haven't actually been put into practice despite many really interesting initiatives, some of which I've been involved in and some of which others have been involved in. And that's frustrating. And maybe it'll change with kind of the next generation of scientists. But really, I still see the PDF as this trophy that people put on their presentation that they send, that they really kind of demand, despite there being better, cheaper, quicker ways of communicating. And so I think we're overdue still for some dramatic changes that the web can bring.
Yeah, Josh, actually, I share your opinion, actually, that cultural change is still needed in our field, in the science. And my impression is also that, that, okay, we are not publishing anymore the hard copies, but we are publishing PDF files. But again, somehow it's, only digitalized our previously way of communication. So I'm expecting that we have, for instance, in traveling, you have, Airbnb, you have the booking, you have, but my impression is that, the tourism is really changed in the last few decades, meaning the channels, how you are looking for the accommodation, how you're organizing your traveling and so on. It's really ridiculous and really big change actually there. But it's not so tremendous change in the science, I think. So I share basically your opinion.
I saw, just to add on to that, I saw recently a tweet of someone sharing all these postcards that their grandpa had received requesting articles via mail. And really, we're still doing kind of this request from the authors, can I read your article, via email? And so it's, the form has kind of changed a little bit, but the practice hasn't changed much.
Yeah, that's interesting, and hopefully in the future it will be changed. Okay, Mike, now it's your turn. Do you have any comment on top of what we already heard from the Josh and Chris?
Yeah, I suppose I have a couple of things to point out. So, my background, before I was a digital science, I was at Elsevier for 20 years, during which time I worked on things like the Future of the Article initiative. And, back then, if we think back to sort of the late 2000s, well, mid 2000s, really, there was a lot of energy in terms of inventing new kinds of ways of communicating the results of scholarly research. And I think it's really noticeable that the pace of innovation has slowed down apparently quite a lot. We don't, when we go to conferences or when we attend conferences like this, we don't find, generally speaking, that people are making, very exciting, very revolutionary suggestions about how scholarly communication can change in the future. Rather, it's much more detailed, much more incremental. But I'm kind of quite old compared to Josh and Cristina, so I kind of want to go back because we talk about things not having changed that much, and that's absolutely true. I'm in the middle of writing a paper at the moment on observation of altmetrics over the last 10 years. And I'm having to do a literature review, of course. I'm having to encapsulate loads of information that already exists. Now, if I was sitting down here and writing some code, I would just be referencing those things. So my introduction, if it were an object-oriented paper of the kind of thing that we might have been talking about 15 years ago, would be reference that paper, or that fact within a paper, that fact within a paper, that fact. And I wouldn't have to do any of the writing of 1,500 words to show that I've read the literature. So in that regard, that thing that we deliver, a PDF file, hasn't changed at all. But let's go back, because when we were thinking about what the future of the article would look like, when we were inviting contributions, when we were attending all these extremely exciting conferences, we did have a vision of what things could look like in the future. And actually, we've gotten used to what we were planning. So now when we go to a platform like Dimensions or like Scopus, everything is connected. The full text is there. We are linked to things like DOIs and ORCIDs. So to some extent, we're starting to link those things. Lots of these platforms have got extracted data running behind them, which make connections between them, which make recommendations. We see things like embedded data and embedded graphics. So to some extent, I mean, the thing that we still talk about, as Josh says, is that PDF. That's the thing we stick on our blog sites. We stick inside the repository. That's not really where the paper is. That's one of the products from that research bundle that we're posting online. And I would just say that although just looking at that PDF file, we say that things haven't changed, we're ignoring that wider picture of what publication has become. And also, we cannot forget that 20 years ago, we didn't have Google Scholar, we didn't have Mendeley, we didn't have ResearchGate. All of those things have been have revolutionized the way that scholars work, and we shouldn't ignore those advances. Although, you know, to some extent, we are guilty of reinventing the same kind of bias that we had 20 years ago when things were in paper, you know, and either they were in English or, you know, they were inaccessible, they weren't in the library. You know, nowadays we have issues, for example, not being able to get hold of data out of ResearchGate. So we don't know whether we can't make that broad scale comparison because ResearchGate doesn't expose their data. Mendeley do, so we can use Mendeley data. So to some extent, you know, we have we still have those issues of open and closed, even built into the new platforms. And that's really frustrating for somebody like me who spends their life working with data, trying to understand and model scientific communication. It's really frustrating that so much of it is still a closed book. And I'll stop there.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much. So my basic question actually for Mike is actually, do you think that, for instance, you mentioned ResearchGate, do you think it's well adopted? There is enough community there? It's some common practice for all researchers from all over the world to be in the ResearchGate, to discuss there. For instance, also the open science paradigm, whether it's enough adopted at the moment. For instance, when I'm organizing this conference, I'm receiving, you know, requests that conference proceedings should be published in some specific by some specific publisher and indexed in some citation databases and so on.
Yeah,
it's still important because I think some, you know, government rules still, you know, take into account where it's indexed and define some promotion rules.
Yeah, they absolutely do. I wish more conferences were indexed. It's an enormously difficult thing to overcome. Of course, we do find increasingly that conferences have got DOIs, so they can appear in things like Dimensions and Scopus, but most conferences don't. And that makes it very hard, particularly for early stage researchers to develop a profile, and particularly, you know, to be able to join things like that to their ORCID records and to show the development of their career over those important first few years are very important. So the question of whether ResearchGate is well used or used enough, it's an interesting one, because Mendeley, for example, we know that Mendeley is, or we assume that Mendeley is less well used than ResearchGate. The difference being that Mendeley data is available CC0, so we can pull it out of an API and use it. Now, that's been proven in the academic record that Mendeley data can be used to, for example, predict citations, to understand early impact, to model readership changes. It's very well understood that when people are very well researched, that when people use Mendeley, they do so with the intention of either reading or citing an article. We know that Mendeley is used by people who are academic researchers, but also industry researchers. So as a data source, because it's open, we know a great deal about it. ResearchGate is closed. Despite their commitment, you cannot go to an API and download numbers. If you could download those numbers, we would understand a lot more about ResearchGate and whether it was usable or not. And I think that's one of those sort of difficulties. It's really challenging to understand the impact of a platform when it's closed, and it's even harder for people to, for example, to create a national system. So, for example, if I were in Romania and I wanted to get ResearchGate numbers for all of research, that is essentially a task of going to every page and getting every number. With Mendeley, there is an API, I can just go and pick it up. And it's that straightforward. And, you know, it is the difference between it taking a few minutes to develop some data or, you know, several months, potentially.
Yeah, I see your point. Yeah, thank you very much. Also, we have one question from the audience from Rosanna Muriel. So Rosanna, can you unmute yourself and raise the question?
Yes, thank you. I agree very much with the fact that digital resources have not changed so much. But I believe that the reason is because the acquisition models that publishers created for libraries, that is big deals, were a way to keep things unchanged because the resources are aggregated on a platform and libraries must buy all the platform, and so it's convenient for publishers to not change so much. While there are some journals and books which experimented with media, with video and multimedia, but they are open access. So my question is, what do you think about this? Why is what is the reason why because technology, the web has evolved. It's not PDF. We have in a multimedia and 2.3.0 web, and this didn't apply to journals and books.
I absolutely agree with you and understand it. The last time I submitted a paper, and I'm not going to name the publisher because I don't want to embarrass them, they asked me for a pager number. Now, I don't know if anybody on the call is old enough to remember what a pager is. It was a small device about that big, and had a little screen on it, and had a telephone number, and if you could send a message, like a text message to it, but all you could really do was to get the number, and then you had to go and find a real telephone. A pager, I haven't seen a pager in 20 or 30 years. And yet the system that this major publisher still uses to accept submissions asks me for a pager number. I was, yeah.
I'm going to be a bit of a devil's advocate here.
Go on.
So publishers are a business, right? So they submit papers because researchers need papers because they're assessed based on those papers. They're assessed based on those PDFs and what is commonly acknowledged in a particular country as being impact. And the definition of impact kind of varies wildly depending on the country. So my home country of Romania has one definition of impact. The UK would have a completely different one. So, and I do believe as a former librarian that the power to influence how publishers behave is with the library and the people that are paying, rather than someone that would change their entire business model to force change on someone that doesn't necessarily want it.
Yeah, I suppose the other thing that's worthwhile mentioning is that, first of all, a great deal of pressure can come from the editorial boards. They tend to be quite conservative. So going back 20 years, I was doing conferences, and I was saying that in the future, a lot of the way that we think about research will be influenced by what people who were in their 20s at that stage were doing with music. And at that time, people were sharing MP3 files on file sharing networks and so on. And I do think that as those people are now in their sort of mid-40s, that we see that the role of sharing material is still really important. But what we can't forget is that the really senior people in their fields tend to be older than that. They're my generation or my generation and older. And for them, that kind of thinking is still probably quite new. And I guess the other thing that I want to throw out there, sort of in defense of big publishers, is the volume of publishers, that the volume of articles they have to deal with. So I, again, when I worked on Scopus, I calculated that at peak, we were parsing, in other words, we were taking in a number of citations every second. We were taking in about 60 citations a second and resolving those to a DOI. So you have to think about that flood of information, to go back to what someone like Eugene Garfield was talking about. When publishers are dealing with millions and millions and millions of articles, potentially millions of articles a year, millions of citations a year, it's really quite hard to change a platform. That doesn't excuse anyone asking for a pager device, and that doesn't excuse anybody not permitting you to embed a video. But there are conservative, slow elements within the publishing cycle that haven't yet got it. And it may sadly be another 10 years before we start seeing that generation, my generation, if you like, of academics moving off the editorial boards and being replaced by people who actually understand Web 2. But you know, that's me being quite pessimistic.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much for that opinion. So maybe, Josh, can you also mention, for instance, you're developing that platform, which should include the smart citation. So I'm not sure whether it's comprehensive as you would like that. It's comprehensive in the meaning of your database, whether it includes a majority of publications all over the world and so on. But anyway, do you believe in that idea that it should be included one day, of course, in the assessment process, in the measuring the impact of some paper and so on? Do you have any feedback from the community, any example of usage of smart citations in some government rules for assessment of, I don't know, trends in some discipline or something as that?
So I think what we call smart citations, Eugene Garfield called citation markers back in the 60s. And so this idea is that we thought was entirely novel and that we're so smart we brought in has been around for quite some while, actually. Because I think people recognize, you know, counting a number and having a list of titles can only get you so much information. More context, more nuance around that list and that number would be helpful. The challenge has been actually doing that because of the formats, because of access. It's not easy to, you know, create a citation index, let alone to try to create a citation index that shows context of citation. It requires access to full text. It requires technical ability to parse full text that come in so many different shapes and sizes. There's, you know, 8,000 different citation styles. There's however many different PDF formats. Extracting that information out of this content is a challenge, a technical challenge. And I think this is, you know, we're actually just lucky to be doing what we do at Cite because a lot of the tools exist now to do that. And I think what we have done is kind of show that it's possible. And I fully expect other citation indices to do something very similar. I've already seen, you know, surveys from Web of Science to their librarian customers asking specifically, what would you call a contrasting citation type? And so they're thinking about it. There's other groups that are, you know, we're selling to pharma groups. There's other groups promising that they're building something similar out there as well. And I think it's inevitable that we will move to what, you know, kind of Cite has shown can be possible. So that is showing the context and then providing different ways to navigate through this context. And so we are not used by any government necessarily right now to say this person should be promoted, this person should not be promoted. But we are used by researchers to do a lot of different things. Some of those are probably evaluation. Many of those things are new uses. We have a lot of student users because I think it allows students to easily see what do experts say about this topic that I'm not an expert in. Whereas, you know, students I don't see using traditional citation metrics because they're used more for bibliometric purposes and more for evaluative purposes. And so I think with new types of data, new ways of evaluating, there'll be new users. And you know, some of these things are hard to predict what that look like. You know, I had no idea that undergrad students would be a major user of citations. I thought this would be primarily grad students, PIs, people in publishing, but you know, the biggest growth that we have is undergrad students. And I think it's because it opens up a new way of looking at kind of literature. But yeah, I mean, I obviously have a lot more to say on the topic of kind of being able to create these things. It's not easy. It's really expensive. You'll notice that there hasn't been really any kind of new citation indices from smaller groups because, you know, you need access, you need huge amounts of resources to do this. And I would say historically, our limitation has been access. We don't have every single publication full text in the world. We have a lot. We've processed 25 million. But we're missing many. And so I think one thing that happened actually this year was Elsevier making their references open. That has allowed us to become much more comprehensive with a mixture of kind of traditional sites and smart sites so that you can see better, you know, the citation record. And you know, to me, that is quite surprising because I know there's a big business behind Scopus. And so to open these up for competitors or new groups to use was welcomed, but surprising to me.
Okay, it's a surprise for you, but I'm happy that you are surprised that they decided to open it. Yeah. Okay, then I suggest to go to the second topic, except we have some comment or question from the audience. So do you have any to add to the discussion so far? If you have, please post your comment in the chat or just raise your hand. But as I said, I suggest to go further. So now the question is, okay, we can discuss whether the things are changed or not, but at least some changes are in progress. And the question is, should we adopt some new metrics? Josh already started the discussion about this smart citation. And in order to adopt those new metrics, what barriers we have in front of us and how we can deal with those barriers, and who should do that? What should be the first step? Who should lead the process, and so on? So how we can change this situation in measuring the research impact at the moment. So Josh, you can start first now, and then I suggest to be the mic, and then Chris at the end.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think, creating any kind of new impact metric is quite difficult, right? There's a massive amount of information, a lot of it coming from closed sources. So to be able to aggregate this information and look at it, whether it's, a tweet or something from ResearchGate, or it's a citation from a publication, the first big challenge is just access, right? We don't have access to a lot of data and information sources that could be used to create new research impact metrics. In addition to that, I think there are, as there are with kind of changes in how we communicate, there's beyond technical changes and beyond data, there's big cultural changes that need to be met. And so there's a lot of pushback on metrics, but they're still used despite such pushback. And I think, even the people that are kind of pushing back on this are using them, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly. And so I think kind of cultural changes of adopting things and limit some of these things. But that doesn't mean that they can't be, quote unquote, overcome. I think to introduce new things, they have to be useful, they have to be understandable, and who they're useful for, determines a lot of this. And so I think there are many there's a lot of new metrics that have existed. There's tons of bibliometric studies on this new metric for innovation, this new metric for that, this new metric for that. A lot of times why they don't have the larger adoption, I would say, is because they're harder to understand. So they need to be understood by not just the bibliometricians using this that can actually read the paper, but by the scientist that is being evaluated by it. And then I would say they need to be somehow tied into ranking. And so I think, the groups, the kind of very simplistic way that I see things is that there is large amounts of money that come from government and funders. This money or tuition, this tuition is tied very strongly to rankings of universities. Rankings of universities is a very contested subject, but it exists. And who uses those rankings and what tools are used for those rankings determines which are adopted and which are bought, right? So the Scopuses and the Web of Sciences of the world can sell to libraries for huge amounts of money because they're used by ranking organizations. And that is very critical to have because, going up one rank or down one rank can have a big influence on the money that the university brings in through tuition. And so I think, if CITE were to be adopted into rankings, I could guarantee that we would have a lot more librarian customers because now they need the same numbers that the ranking organizations are working with. And so I think, maybe this went off on a bit of a tangent, but the challenges are kind of technical, cultural, and then certainly, aligning that with who's actually putting up money to kind of drive some of these changes, which I think is embedded into rankings, both at the university level, but also at the journal level.
Yeah, it seems as that changes should be announced in advance, meaning we need some roadmap how we are going to change that and so on. And also you mentioned so that from different sources we can collect some information. Some sources are open, some are unfortunately closed. But anyway, do you think that we need some standardization in the APIs of those different sources, some standardization of the formats, maybe also some standardization in the field of quality assurance, how they validate the information they are providing and so on?
I mean, yes and no. I think it's, there's a lot of different metrics we could introduce, even at CITE or even, changes to Altmetric. And I don't think all of them should actually be introduced just because they can, right? Even if the data was fully there. And so I think we have to think very, critically about you know, what is, if we start to count this behavior, what are the effects of that? Is that something that we want? And so, you know, altmetrics, arguably, there's many different interesting kind of outcomes of starting to look at how things are shared socially. I think some of those are positive, but I certainly think some of those also have, you know, limitations as well. And so I think, yes, standardization would help and make things easier, but, you know, even standards of JATS XML are only so standardized. You know, there's one JATS XML from one publisher looks 10 different ways, and we have to deal with that, and it's minor, but that's not kind of the biggest barrier. You know, we're also dealing with PDFs. I would much rather have a PDF than not have anything at all. And so I think those are the first hurdles is access. But I think it's really important to kind of think, you know, what are the new metrics that should be, not just let's build everything that we can, because, you know, these do impact people's lives, and it's also a significant undertaking to develop them.
Yeah, the question is how we should actually assess the research impact these days. Yeah. So Mike, it's your turn now for this topic. Do you have anything to add on this discussion?
Oh, I have lots to say. Yeah, as Josh says, I mean, the biggest problem is not having data. Standardizations, it's okay. It's okay. But, you know, generally speaking, we've gotten past this problem where we have a multitude of technologies for APIs. We have one technology. We have good identifiers. Please use DOIs. Please use ORCID. These things make life a lot easier for people like Josh and myself who have to pull this data together. I don't really care about standardization, not nearly as much, because nowadays it is so much easier for me to jump into GBQ and to write a filter that will deal with or look up some data. But the hardest thing is when the data isn't available, or where the data may be available, but there's no license available and you don't know how to use it, or you don't get reply to your email. So for example, I was looking at capturing some data. There's what looks like an open API that I can get hold of. I can get hold of the data. There's no licensing information embedded in the data. There's no license information on the website. And the people on the other end of the website won't answer my emails or my messages or my Slacks. So although the data's there, I can't do anything with it. And it's really unfortunate, because it's kind of exciting data. But, you know, this is my own little axe that I am choosing to grind. So there's a lot of reasons why we've got barriers for adoptions. And I think a lot of this goes back to who the stakeholders are who are involved in creating metrics, and what is the purpose of those metrics that we're trying to accomplish. And to some extent, this is echoing what Josh was saying. It's no longer the case that metrics and data are this specialized area that only a handful of bibliometricians are allowed to use and to interpret. It is now the case that this data is largely open and everybody has the technical skills to deal with it. What we need to do is to socialize the insights that we have from this data. I've just, last month, I rejected 2 papers into 2 learned journals because they were essentially going back and exploring altmetric data, things that we've known for years. There's no new insights here. They need to go away and do a literature review and actually figure out, learn what we know about altmetric data, because we've got either 10 or 11 years of research into altmetric data, or if you go back to Webometrics, please do, then we have over 20 years of research in this space. We actually know quite a lot about what altmetric data is. We know its we know its weaknesses, we know its strengths, we know what the trends are. We need to be socializing this and not reinventing the wheel. We should be able to start building on these numbers to create metrics that enable us to answer some of the new emerging use cases that we're only just beginning to talk about. You know, things like, what are the implications of being open access? What are the implications of publishing in English versus some other language? How does that affect the ability for people to communicate? How does one publisher's strategy alter another one? These things are not connected these things are connected to the way that society receives information. Now, so I mentioned the paper that I'm writing at the moment, and one of the things that I'm looking at is very long-term altmetrics. So, for example, we look at policy citations. They are one of the most conservative indicators that you can possibly find. It typically seems to be taking 5 to 8 years for a piece of research to be having social impact in terms of its citations appearing in policy documents. There are some really interesting questions there. How do we accelerate that? What were the notions here of trust? What can we do to support the propagation of research into the policy domain? Do editorial boards, do publishers, do societies, do they need to start thinking about recruiting more people who use that research in a social dimension onto their editorial boards to increase that speed of information, of research going from the laboratory or the lecture room or the seminar room into society? I'm going to be quiet in a minute, but one of the examples that I wanted to throw out there that I've just started exploring with a researcher in Brisbane, University of Queensland, is the relationship that the humanities and the social sciences have to technological innovations. So if we go back 10, 11 years, we can see the development of the field of self-driving cars coming out of the computer labs. And we go back 10, 11 years, this is a computer science problem, 100% a computer science problem. Then math starts throwing in, and then there's engineering issues coming in. But even now, even if we look at that breakdown of research from last year, it's still about 92, 93% computer science, mathematics, engineering. We look at that, and then the next 5% is the psychology of human-computer interaction. There is almost no research into the social effects of self-driving cars, what that means to the environment, what that means to planning regulations, whether the data we're using is basically just white men who can afford Teslas, or whether it reflects the broader network of society. We know almost nothing about that. And the piece of work that this researcher and I want to have a look at is whether we can create some metric that highlights technological research and makes a case for the social science and the humanities to be involved much earlier down the line. Because actually the problem that we have in the humanities is that we are being responsive when it's almost too late to be responsive. And for me, this is one of those things that's kind of quite interesting. We can break down some of these barriers. To go back to the original point, we can break down some of these barriers by going back to that data and using our research to understand what that data means. And I'll stop.
Okay, thank you, Mike. But you mentioned so that we are lacking in the access to the data. Also, Josh mentioned that. So maybe it's more for the third topic of this panel. But anyway, I would like to ask you now, what do you think should be changed in the future that we have the access to the data? Because, you know, some companies, it's a part of the business model to cataloging and selling the data. Do you think it will be changed in the future, and how? Or you know, some new companies will appear who will catalog that access and make the business model on some different services? Or
It is really difficult, and I'm not going to name names again. So I worked on ORCID as one of the original architects, and we had a conference about 18 months, 2 years in, on identifiers, scholarly identifiers, and somebody from an enormous company whose everyone will have use their products every day, many of their products every day. They came along to this conference and they said, you know, what we need is a universal identifier for researchers and academics. And we were like, but we've been doing this for 2 years and you don't come to our meetings. I mean, this was sort of one of those things. It's like, well, I'm really glad you're thinking about that. We've also been thinking about it. Why don't you come along to our meetings, or indeed answer our emails? There are actually problems. It is one of those things. It's a little bit of a mystery. It can be very difficult to even find a working email address at some of these companies. They don't answer the emails. They don't answer your Slacks. You know, there are a number of issues there. But nevertheless, their platforms are incredibly popular. or we believe they're incredibly popular. It's impossible to know. And I think that this kind of comes down to, questions of organizations like the European Commission saying, we would like to use this data, but it's not open. Now, we've seen that places like the EC have been able to mandate change or to affect change within enterprises. And I think it's probably time that they start thinking, a little bit about how they can interact with some of these other organizations, possibly. The open access movement has its roots in the 1990s. It starts growing in the 2000s, but it's not until Obama comes along that it is absolutely, rocketed. And you can have a look at the graph, and it goes from growing, a few tens of thousands to growing to hundreds of thousands. It was an exponential jump because Obama mandated it. We can do this. And, if we are serious about wanting to use some of these data points, some of these raw data points, for people like Josh, for people like Chris, for people like me to use, and to make sense of them and to research them. There's an awful lot of due diligence that needs to be done with data types, with new data sources. It's not a trivial matter of just putting an account out there. There's a great deal of expertise and academic research as well as technical research that needs to be done. So, we're not neutral. We do have this relationship with organizations like you do in Romania, not anymore in the UK. We don't have this relationship with the European Commission, sadly. But we're not neutral when it comes to using this data.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm coming from scientific community. I'm not involved in any company or something as that, and I can say how we feel we who are coming from the scientific community are feeling. Actually, so we are performing the review process. We are writing the papers, we are publishing, but then it's some other company business based on our work somehow, Also, for instance, those information coming from scientific community, and then someone is cataloging that and then selling us back that we can use for our, promotion or assessment or whatever. Somehow it's strange for me, but I'm not an expert in the business, and probably as a majority of the scientific community. So the situation as is. So Chris, it's your turn now to comment on this topic.
Thank you. I'll actually start with a slightly cheeky quote from John Green, and he says, "Damn truth, always resisting simplicity." And it's pretty much the same in this situation, because it's not just one thing that needs to change. There are multiple very different pieces of a puzzle that need to change. But the thing that baffles me the most is that we're trying to assess research that is not expressed just through publications, regardless of the format of that publication, but we're still trying to assess research today with tools, or at least the mindset of 20 years ago. So we're looking at citations and publication citations, because of course patents have their own types of citations, but they're very small and very close type conversations when it comes to just moving beyond that type of assessment. And then there's also the discussion that it needs to be very different according to the different disciplines. And I know that we have field level metrics, but how can it be, in some countries at least, more important to have citations than fill up a stadium and people coming to your concerts? Like these things kind of short circuit my brain to some extent. And then when it comes to barriers, it's all about skills, the way we are assessed and funded, what Mike and Josh mentioned about the data or the metadata being made available. It can be in whatever container, but the data needs to live somewhere. And then if you're very good with the API, you don't need a third-party vendor to come and sell you that data or to sell you the insights, better yet. You can do it by yourself. And then there's an additional part, which is when you have to make strategic decisions, trying to use metrics that everyone uses might not necessarily fit that particular decision. So there's also a need for a conversation of how can I make a decision that benefits my university in my context for this very specific reason. And it might not really be like, I don't know, I don't want to name metrics of any sort, but it might not be ones that are very popular at the moment. And when it comes to first step, I think that's already been done by a variety of organizations, just very different first steps. Some might be just banning a metric, others are just changing how they fund research or how they assess research. There are steps there, it's just that they're very different throughout the world.
Okay, thank you very much. So unfortunately, we have only 10 minutes till the end of the panel and one more topic. So I suggest to go to that last one topic and for your final comment, of course. And I'm really ridiculous whether our I'm curious whether our future is bright or dark on this topic, actually. So what we can expect in the next 5 to 10 years, whether anything will be changed. So Mike is first in this round, and then will be the Chris, and then Josh at the end. So Mike.
Thank you. So one of the things that I've seen over the last five years or so is an increasing democratization of metrics. Now, as I said before, it used to be the case that the only people who had access to this data and had the tools to handle this data were essentially people who are bibliometricians, who come at this field from a particular problem, a particular position with a particular cultural legacy. And what I've seen over the last few years is there's been an enormous growth in the number of people who have access to this data and who are prepared to get their hands dirty, as we say, and to start working with this data. The librarianship community, for sure, but also people like Josh and myself who come at this from a data science perspective. And I think that what this means is that we're going to see, I think bibliometricians will carry on being important, of course, but I think increasingly we're going to see more diversity of view and a theoretical approach to understanding what research means. So, you know, for I'm very fortunate in that I get to work with a number of academics. One of my colleagues, Tânia Oliveira in Brazil, for example, is a social scientist who has been using altmetrics to understand the social propagation of research, coming at it from the perspective of a social scientist with a very different set of theories that very different from anything that a bibliometrician would be accustomed to using. And I'm really hoping that we see an increasing amount of diversity in this. It can only be good for the field that we start having more people coming at this problem. And I just wanted to single out yet another name. So someone like Professor Qiaomei Chen in Drexel, who I'm sure Josh will know. Qiaomei Chen is a phenomenal researcher who's been looking at measures of certainty in research. So, for example, if you go back to the 1990s, you can find expressions in the literature that will say something like HIV may be the cause of AIDS, or HIV is suspected in the cause of AIDS. And over the course of the next 20 or 30 years, you see that that kind of statement going from being probabilistic, suggested, hypothetical, to being registered as a fact. And what Qiaomei does is to look at the drift in that kind of statement, so that, and that's an incredibly important thing because it goes to the very heart of understanding what science is and how quickly science is progressing and whether the nature of research is changing. Things like that at the moment still belong in the laboratory. So Qiaomei has an amazing tool called CiteSpace that he uses. It's quite complicated to use, but it's a great tool to use. I thoroughly recommend it. There are lots more to come out of that help us to socialize, to surface some of these insights. Another thing to shout out, VOS Viewer, an amazing way of understanding research networks and to really visualize the impact individual teams have on research. So I think we're on the cusp of a really exciting time. But it's all to do with becoming more diverse, becoming more inclusive, becoming more international, becoming more multidisciplinary than we have been over the course of the last 20 years.
Yeah, thank you very much. We were lucky that Qiaomei Chen actually accepted to be our keynote speakers, and he had a keynote talk 2 days ago at this conference, actually.
I missed that. He's a wonderful, wonderful person.
And in the first year of the conference, the last year actually, the Nice Jan van Eck from CWCVTC presented was viewer actually. So it was happened the last year. So we were lucky to have really great speakers in the field of bibliometry and centimetrics. In these 2 years also we had Lutz Leidersdorf as a keynote speaker, who is also quite famous bibliometricians. So Chris, it's now your turn for some optimistic message, please. Give us some nice message at the end of the panel.
And I'm just going to say that I agree 100% with what Mike said. We are experiencing a sort of democratization of access to data. And I've seen some really fabulous analyses at universities and corporates alike. So I guess in the next 5 to 10 years, it will be more around polishing that data story that we were also talking about yesterday, and trying to get the conversation outside of the academia. So the regular Joe, so myself, that is not an academic, can understand why a particular piece of research is of value to the community it has been funded by, because research in most countries is funded by taxpayer money, right? So how do you prove that value? And I guess, and I hope in the next 5 to 10 years, those kinds of discussions would move into a more open type of discussion to involve regular people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, generally speaking, to digital science, and as Cite, you're also contributing to the better world in the view of scientific community. Yeah, and Josh, it's your turn to give us some message to bring to our home, some optimistic, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo what they both have said, is that there's a lot of different ways to look at this data, and that is becoming increasingly easier for others to do it. And so there's a lot of, CiteSpace and Voss Viewer have been around for a while. There's a lot of new ones that are used, they've gone viral, right? There's TikTok videos about using a tool called Connected Papers, or about a tool called, or about Cite, right? This is not something I would have predicted. And so I think because people can look at this data, and these people can be individuals, they can be 2 people, they don't have to be a huge organization, they can develop new ways of looking at it. And I think that democratization helps. It's not all of them are going to be useful, not all of them will kind of really be adopted or last, but having these little types of experiments will allow different groups to test them, and I'll see that continuing. The other thing that I would say is, I think the context, so again, a visualization or a citation context will become increasingly important, right? Like, how is something being tweeted versus how many times something is being tweeted is a different way to look at it. How is this being cited in this field versus in this field? All these types of contexts are important. And I think we're starting to see new groups like Cite introducing different ways of looking at the context, but also the large incumbents are starting to think about this. Web of Science is releasing enriched citations or enriched references, which show this paper, as referenced from the introduction 3 times. And that's starting to get, beyond the context. And so I think the larger groups always will move a bit slower for a variety of different reasons. So it's been exciting to see a lot of small groups working with data from open APIs like Semantic Scholar to create kind of new ways of looking at it. And I think that will continue to increase. And I think the other thing that will happen is we will start to look at other things. So we're still, very much looking at citations or even smart citations. There's a lot more that you can look at.